The wind howled in gusts, like invisible blades seeping through the cracks in the cold brick wall. Malik huddled deeper into the dark corner of the abandoned train station, his thin hands clutching the threadbare woolen scarf, its many holes worn, as if clinging to the last vestiges of warmth. In front of him, a small fire was dying. Only a few red embers flickered on the half-burned pile of wood scraps, just enough to cast a weak, unsteady light. Malik rubbed his knees, trying to ease the numbness, then pulled his legs tighter to his chest, his breath forming fleeting white clouds that quickly vanished into the frigid air. Outside, the wind battered the lampposts, making the pale yellow light flicker as if about to go out. Thick snow blanketed everything, turning the city into a desolate white wasteland. Malik shrank further into the icy wall, his ears straining to catch the chaotic sounds of the blizzard. Then, amidst the howling wind, another sound wormed its way in, small, weak, almost swallowed by the snowstorm. It was a human voice, a cry for help. Broken, as if out of breath, and panicked. Malik raised his head, his eyes fixed on the white expanse outside. A heavy beat echoed in his chest. He held his breath, listening again. And this time, he was sure. Someone was out there, trapped in the storm. Malik pressed himself even closer to the cold stone, calculating. A storm this big was no joke. Stepping out alone at a time like this, without any support, was like throwing his life at death itself. But then he thought of the cry he had just heard. If that person wasn't helped, they would die. He looked down, his hand gripping the edge of his blanket, pulling it closer to his neck, a habit whenever he had to make a difficult decision. Malik glanced quickly at the small fire in front of him. If he left, it would go out. He would have no warmth to return to. But he knew better than anyone. A human life was more important than a pile of ashes. With a decisive movement, Malik took a short piece of wood and struck the burning part, extinguishing the flames to prevent them from spreading in his absence. Each action was careful, because he had learned that on the streets, every small oversight came with a painful price. Finished, he stood up, pulling the thin scarf around his neck. His old, worn-soled shoes scraped softly against the ground. Malik stepped out of the dark corner of the station, hunching his shoulders as the first blast of cold wind hit him directly in the face. The cold cut into his skin like tiny knives. He squinted, raising a hand to shield his face, and took slow steps toward the sound he had heard. Each step was heavy. The thick snow reached his calves, hindering him as if trying to hold him back. The wind whipped through the alleys, throwing small flakes of snow into his eyes, forcing him to keep his head down. But Malik didn't stop. Only one thought remained in his head. Someone was waiting. Someone was in need. He moved forward, his ears straining to catch the slightest sound, trying to distinguish between the cry for help and the howling wind. His palms were icy, his tattered sleeves were covered in snow. Each breath became heavier, but Malik continued to walk. His thin shoes soaked up the cold water, making each toe feel frozen, but he gritted his teeth, telling himself to keep going. In the middle of a deserted open space, Malik stopped. He raised his head, looking around. There was no one in sight. Only the lampposts flickered in the wind and the endless white sheets of snow. Then, like a faint whisper, another sound came, closer this time. Malik turned his head in the direction of the sound, wading through the thick snow. His small legs wobbled slightly, but didn't falter. A faint light appeared in the distance, a reflection of something metallic. He took a deep breath, then leaned forward, increasing his pace. Malik dragged his heavy steps through the snow that was almost up to his knees. He lowered himself, trying to reduce the resistance of the wind that lashed relentlessly at his small frame. His hands were numb, no longer able to feel his fingers clearly. His dry, cracked lips were bleeding, but Malik didn't notice. Every thought in his head was now centered on the faint cry for help he had heard earlier. Each breath Malik inhaled was like a knife cutting into his throat, a chilling pain that made him shiver. Every step was as heavy as if he were wearing stones, the snow-covered path making it easy for him to lose his way. He turned his head back, no longer able to distinguish the old path. Everything was white, hazy, like a giant blanket covering the entire city. In a moment when he felt like he was about to collapse, a faint light flashed in the middle of the white night. Malik squinted, trying to determine the direction. The light was unstable, flickering as if about to go out, but it was enough for him to see a glimmer of hope in the midst of despair. Without hesitation, Malik stretched forward, gritting his teeth as he ran toward the light. His thin legs waded through the snow, each step dragging with immense weight. The closer he got, the clearer the image became. A silver SUV, half buried in the snow, lay askew in the deserted street. The headlights were still on, casting a faint glow that diffused through the thick fog clinging to the windshield. Malik rushed to the side of the car. His breath came in heavy gasps as he raised his hand and banged hard on the window. "Is anyone in there?" Malik yelled, his voice torn apart by the fierce howling of the wind. There was no response. Inside, there was only a blurry figure, head resting on the steering wheel. Malik immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. He pressed his face against the glass, trying to see more clearly. The person wasn't moving. The snow had piled thick on the roof of the car, indicating that it had been stuck there longer than Malik had thought. Malik glanced around, searching for something that could help him break the window. His hand touched a hard stone hidden under the snow on the side of the road. Without hesitation, he bent down and picked it up. Malik took a step back, tightening his grip on the icy stone in his hand. He looked at the window one more time, then took a deep breath and threw it with all his might. A sharp, shattering sound echoed in the dark night. Shards of glass flew out, scattering onto the snow. Malik immediately reached in, searching for the door lock. His hand was bleeding from the broken glass, but he didn't hesitate. After a few clumsy seconds, he pulled the inside handle. The heavy door creaked open, groaning under the weight of the ice and snow. Freezing air rushed into the car. Malik stepped forward, carefully supporting the unconscious woman, whose head was tilted to one side. Her belly was round and swollen, a pregnant woman in her final months. Malik froze for a beat, his hands hovering in the air. Then, as if driven by an instinct, he slipped his arms under hers, struggling to pull the woman from the driver's seat. Her body was limp, offering no resistance. Her weak breath brushed against Malik's neck, reminding him that the life within her was fading with each passing second. Without thinking further, Malik quickly unwrapped the woolen scarf from around his own body, wrapping it tightly around the woman's frame, trying to shield her from the biting wind. He himself shivered uncontrollably, his thin jacket offering little protection against the razor-sharp wind that tore at his skin. But he didn't stop. Malik glanced around, quickly assessing the situation. They couldn't stay here long. The wind was getting stronger every moment. The freezing temperatures would kill them both if they didn't find shelter immediately. Malik's gaze fell upon a makeshift sled made from two pieces of wood lashed together, lying haphazardly by the side of the road, the very thing he used to haul odds and ends when scavenging for survival. Malik shuffled over, pulling the sled closer. He carefully lifted the woman, placing her onto the icy wooden surface. With all the strength he had left, he pulled the tattered old blanket over her, tucking the corners tightly to keep out the wind. Finished, Malik squatted down, using his hands to clear some of the snow from the road surface to create a small path for the sled. The wind howled again, stronger than before. He gripped the rope tied to the front of the sled, bent his back, and began to pull. His small hands were pale with cold, but Malik tightened his grip on the rope, bracing himself against the wind that threatened to knock him over. He bent low, shifting all his weight forward. The sled moved inch by inch on the slippery surface. The wheels creaked under the weight, but Malik didn't stop. He gritted his teeth and kept going. Each pull was a battle against the storm, a promise not to give up. Malik knew better than anyone that in this pitch-black night, just a moment of stopping would mean the end. The wind roared in his ears, tearing apart other sounds. Snow pelted his face, stinging like needles. He just kept his head down and pulled. Not a single complaint escaped his lips, not a single step backward. On his young face, his pale purple lips were pressed into a tight line, his eyes shining with a fierce light. Belief that no matter how much life had battered him, tonight, Malik would not let this woman die. Malik hunched his back, tightening his grip on the rope, pulling the sled slowly through the howling snowstorm. Each step forward seemed to sink him deeper into the cold. His small hands trembled, his legs plunged into the soft snow, leaving deep holes each time he pulled his feet out. His breath turned into thick white clouds, dissolving as soon as they hit the freezing air. But Malik didn't stop. He looked straight ahead, where the faint yellow light of the last working lamppost flickered in the distance. The path leading down to the old train station, the makeshift shelter he called home. Just need to get there. Malik murmured to himself, his whisper dissolving into the wind. The wind whipped harder, flipping up the thin fabric of his coat. The hand gripping the rope was bleeding, but Malik gritted his teeth and endured. The woman behind him lay still, her hair disheveled, the old blanket draped over her shaking violently in the wind. Finally, after a journey that felt endless, Malik stumbled into the familiar narrow alley, the flickering lamppost light above his head. The sled clattered down the steps leading into the station. Malik bent low, trying to keep his balance so the sled wouldn't tip over. When it reached the cold concrete floor of the train station, he almost collapsed, his whole body exhausted. Not allowing himself to give in, Malik slowly helped the woman off the sled. He laid down the old newspapers, the kind he had scavenged from the trash cans a few days ago, in a corner of the station near the ashes of the fire. Malik gently placed her down. His hands trembled as he readjusted the thin woolen scarf around her, trying to shield her from the cold seeping up from the ground. In the dim light, Malik could clearly see the woman's face, as white as wax, her lips blue, her eyes tightly closed. A shiver ran down his spine. He knew, if he didn't do something right now, she wouldn't make it. Malik turned to the dying fire beside him, where only a few red embers still flickered. He picked up a broken wooden table leg, something left over from scavenging for scraps in a nearby storage yard. His hands trembled as he broke the leg in two, creating more fuel. Using his swollen red hands, Malik neatly arranged the pieces of wood, taking out a few dry scraps of paper he had saved from his pocket. He leaned close, blowing gently, trying to rekindle the remaining embers. His breath puffed out, white smoke rising in bursts. A faint glow flared. Malik pursed his lips, patiently blowing steadily, each breath light, each puff cautious. The fire flickered, then burst into a small flame the size of his fist. The amber light flickered on the grimy walls of the train station, chasing away some of the cold darkness. Malik quickly added more wood scraps, old rags, pushing them into the fire, tending to it with care, as if protecting a precious life. The air in the station gradually warmed, if only a little. But that much was the difference between life and death. Malik turned back to the woman. Her lips were less blue, but there was still no sign of her regaining consciousness. He bent down, pressing his ear to her chest. Her heart was still beating, weakly, but alive. Malik sighed in relief, reaching out to gently shake her shoulder. "Mom?" Malik called softly, his voice hoarse. After a long moment, the woman's body stirred slightly. A groan escaped her pale lips. She slowly opened her eyes, the flickering firelight reflected in her wide, dazed eyes. She looked around, her lips trembling as if trying to form words. "Don't be scared. You're safe now," Malik said quickly, his voice urgent but gentle. The woman blinked, trying to focus her gaze on the small boy in front of her. His face was dirty, his hair tangled, his clothes soaked with snow water, but in his eyes shone a sincerity that made her feel at ease. I'm Isabella," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. Malik nodded, relieved that she could speak. "I'm Malik," the boy replied, inching closer to the fire, giving her more of the warmth. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something more, but her body wouldn't allow it. "Don't talk. You need to rest," Malik quickly whispered, pulling the tattered blanket more snugly around her. Isabella nodded weakly, then drifted off to sleep again, her breathing slower but more regular than before. Malik sat quietly beside her, his hand holding the blanket firmly, his eyes not leaving the fire. Outside, the blizzard still raged fiercely. Malik leaned his head against the wall, his eyelids heavy. But before drifting off into a short sleep, he reached out and carefully added a few more pieces of wood to the fire, keeping it burning through the night. The bitter sky stretched into days without sunlight. The blizzard had subsided, but the cold still clung to every street corner, every breath. Against the white backdrop, Malik was a tiny speck of ink, his thin frame dragging through the heavy snow. The boy's legs felt like they were weighed down with stones, his knees almost numb each time he had to lift them to take another step. But Malik didn't stop. In his mind, the image of the woman lying still in the corner of the train station, her lips blue, occasionally letting out a soft moan in her fitful sleep, was the only reason he kept going. The threadbare woolen scarf was wrapped tightly around his neck. Beneath his thin jacket, his small body shivered with cold and hunger. Malik hurried from one street to another, searching for any sign of life. A shop still open, a stall still awake, someone still braving the storm. Most of the shops were closed. The window panes were frosted over. The signs hung crookedly. The streets deserted, as if the world had forgotten them. Finally, Malik stopped in front of a small bakery. A faint light flickered from inside, a faint warmth seeping through the cracks in the door. The boy took a deep breath, bracing himself before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The shop door's bell chimed softly, announcing his presence. The middle-aged man behind the counter looked up. A frown briefly crossed his face when he saw Malik, with his dirty and shivering appearance. "We don't give handouts here. Get lost," the man said, his voice cold, his hand constantly wiping the counter. Malik quickly took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I just need a little bread. I'll work. I can sweep too." The man snorted, waving his hand as if shooing away a bothersome fly. "No bread for beggars. Get out." A rough hand pushed Malik out of the door, causing him to stumble and almost fall face first onto the snow-covered sidewalk. The glass door slammed shut behind him, the shop bell ringing out cruelly. Malik stood silently, his hands clenched, his eyes stinging. He didn't cry. It had been a long time since Malik had learned not to cry anymore. A shiny black car was parked nearby. A man in a long dark coat and a high-quality woolen scarf stepped out. He paused, his eyes scanning the scene in front of the bakery. It was Adrian Whitmore. Outwardly, he still maintained the polished demeanor of a successful businessman. But beneath that facade, Adrian was a broken man. Broken by the grief of losing his wife, his family, and the last remaining fragments of hope. In the past few days, Adrian had spent money like water, hiring helicopters and search teams, scouring every corner of the city. But the blizzard had rendered all efforts futile. Bad news had followed bad news, cold, disjointed traces. No one knew where Isabella was. No one. Now, seeing a child shivering in the snow, chased away from the bakery like an unwanted shadow, Adrian's heart clenched. Without thinking, he approached. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deep and hoarse, sounding as if he himself didn't believe in his own stability. Malik flinched, instinctively taking half a step back. Adrian crouched down so his eyes were level with Malik's. His eyes, tired but still bright, looked directly at the boy. "Do you need help?" Malik hesitated, his lips pressed tightly together. Instinct told him to be careful of adults, but the exhaustion and worry for Isabella were greater. He swallowed, then whispered, "I need a little bread. Not for me, for a lady who's hurt." Adrian paused, his heart pounded in his chest. A wounded woman, in this storm. "Where is she?" Adrian asked, his voice tightening. Malik looked around, as if afraid someone would hear, then whispered, "In the train station, near the old parking lot. She can't walk. She has a baby." Adrian stood up abruptly. His breath came in gasps, his heart racing. All the scattered pieces in his mind suddenly fell into place. A pregnant woman, trapped in the blizzard. A ray of hope, fragile but bright, flickered in Adrian's heart. He bent down, placing his hand on Malik's shoulder, his eyes becoming earnest. "Can you take me to her?" Malik looked at him, hesitating for a moment. He wasn't sure if he should trust this strange man, but the look in his eyes full of pain, but also determination, made him nod. Adrian gave a smile so slight it was almost imperceptible. He quickly turned back to the bakery, ignoring the shopkeeper's surprised look, and bought 2 large bags of bread, water, and some canned goods. Finished, he handed one bag to Malik, keeping the other for himself. "Let's go," Adrian said. And deep down, Adrian prayed that this time God would not turn away. The bakery door closed behind them, the last of the warm light fading. Before Malik and Adrian lay an endless expanse of white snow, the wind howling in gusts as if to tear apart the very air. Malik clutched the straps of the food bag, glancing back at Adrian one last time before bowing his head and plunging straight into the snowdrift ahead. His bare feet sank deep into the thick, heavy snow, each step a dragging struggle against the ground itself. His small hands gripped the hem of Adrian's coat, pulling him along the narrow alleys he knew would offer some shelter from the wind. Adrian followed closely behind, each step faltering. His neat suit was now covered in ice and snow, his expensive leather shoes slipping constantly on the icy pavement. No fewer than 3 times he fell face first into the freezing snow, each fall a sharp reminder of the brutal reality. His middle-aged body no longer had the resilience of his younger years. But he wouldn't allow himself to stop. Each time he fell, he only needed to look at the small figure ahead, still hunched against the wind, still trudging forward, and he would clench his fists, get back up, and continue on. The cold wind lashed at his face, making every inch of skin sting as if burned by fire. Small chunks of ice clung to Adrian's hair, beard, and eyelashes. But he didn't care. In his heart at that moment, there was only one driving force. He had to find Isabella. He had to save his wife. After walking some distance, Malik turned his head and saw Adrian staggering slowly, his face pale with cold. He hesitated for a moment, then stopped and thrust the bag of bread into Adrian's hands. "You take it!" Malik shouted, his voice torn into thin fragments by the wind. Adrian caught the bag, frowning. "You'll be colder!" Malik didn't answer, just motioned for him to follow closely, then quickened his pace. He knew these parts well, the narrow shortcuts, the wind-sheltered alleys, and the stretches of road where the snow had frozen into a thinner, easier-to-walk layer. Using the street smarts he had accumulated during his years of wandering, Malik led Adrian through little-known paths. Not a word was spoken, only gestures with his hands and eyes. Between the two strangers, a fragile thread of trust was woven from the urgency of their situation. The storm didn't let up on them. Each strong gust of wind that whipped through made their small and large figures sway. Snow flew in thick clouds, covering their shoulders, hair, and faces. Several times Malik had to stop and use his hands to brush away the thick snow clinging to Adrian's face so he could continue to breathe. Adrian, a man accustomed to warm rooms, leather armchairs, and elegant closed-door meetings, now trudged along the frozen sidewalk, each step a struggle to wrest every inch of ground from death. And then, after a windy bend, Malik pointed ahead, shouting, "Over there!" Adrian raised his head, squinting through the thick snow. A dim shadow appeared, the entrance to the train station. Without a second thought, he quickened his pace, running despite his legs feeling like they were about to give out. The steps leading down to the station were covered in snow and slippery ice. Adrian slipped again, his knee hitting the edge of a step hard, a jolt of pain shooting through him. But he didn't make a sound. He pushed himself up, got to his feet, and continued to descend. In the cold darkness of the train station, a small light flickered, the firelight. And beside that faint flame, Isabella lay. She lay on old newspapers, wrapped in the tattered woolen scarf. Her hair was tangled and matted with snow, her face so pale it almost blended into the color of the cold ground. Adrian paused for a second, as if struck down by an invisible force. Then he rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her. "Isabella! Isabella!" His cry broke through the frigid air. Malik stopped at the entrance, his small hands clasped tightly together in front of his chest. He didn't dare approach, just watched silently, a vague worry rising in his heart. Adrian's hand trembled as he pressed it against his wife's cheek. Her skin was icy, but there was still a faint warmth. He could feel her weak, fragile breaths, like spider silk. "I'm here. Isabella, I'm here now," Adrian whispered, his voice breaking with each choked sob. Isabella stirred slightly, her eyelashes fluttering. A small groan escaped her dry lips. "Adrian." The call was as thin as a breath of wind, but to him it was like a peal of salvation. Adrian bent down, pressing his forehead against hers, letting his tears mingle with the melting snow on her face. Malik stood still, his throat tight. He felt like an outsider in that sacred moment. But deep down, he also knew that he himself, his stubbornness, his small courage, had played a part in this miraculous reunion. A moment later, Adrian turned his head, his eyes red, but shining with a glimmer of determination. "You saved her," he said, his voice full of weight. Malik just shook his head slightly, looking down. He didn't think he had done anything great. He only knew that when he heard the faint cry in the blizzard, he hadn't turned away. Adrian squeezed Malik's shoulder tightly as a way of expressing the deepest gratitude that words couldn't convey. "We have to get her out of here. Now." Malik nodded quickly. Both of them set to work. Adrian bent down, carefully lifting Isabella into his arms. Her body was limp and frighteningly cold, as if her last warmth had already departed. Malik ran ahead, pulling open the back door of the black SUV that Adrian had parked right in front of the bakery. Adrian gently laid Isabella on the back seat. The thin blanket Malik had brought was spread out to cushion her. Then quickly, another layer was added to keep her warm. Malik sat down on the floor of the car, pressing close to Isabella, his hand holding her icy hand, rubbing it gently in the hope of warming her. Adrian went around to the driver's seat and started the car, but the engine only produced dry, gasping sounds. Adrian pressed the accelerator again and again. The car shook, but didn't start. He slammed his hand on the steering wheel, a choked curse escaping his throat. Malik looked up, his eyes panicked. He didn't understand anything about cars, but he could sense, from Adrian's expression, they were stuck. In this cold, "She won't last long," Malik stammered. Adrian lowered his head, exhaling sharply, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Malik didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open and plunged straight out. The cold wind hit him so hard it almost knocked him over. Malik bent over, then stood up straight in the empty, icy street. His two small arms were raised, waving frantically. "Help, please!" Malik yelled, the shout tearing at his throat, but the wind swallowed it almost immediately. His bare feet trembled, his hands were red and numb with cold. But Malik didn't give up. He just stood there, waving his arms continuously, calling until his voice was hoarse. Suddenly, through the swirling white snow, a flashing blue light appeared. An ambulance rushed toward them, its flashing lights casting streaks of light through the dark night. Malik almost collapsed with relief. The ambulance braked sharply, tires skidding lightly on the ice. Two paramedics, one male and one female, jumped out and ran over. "Did that little boy call us?" the woman asked, her voice hurried. "Yes. Here, please hurry." Malik almost sobbed, pulling the female paramedic's hand towards the SUV as he spoke. Adrian had already flung open the car door, cradling the barely conscious Isabella in his arms. The paramedics quickly approached. One knelt down to check her pulse and breathing, while the other pulled a stretcher from the ambulance. "She's in labor," the female paramedic reported quickly, a look of tension on her face. "Severe hypothermia. We can't delay." The two worked with practiced efficiency, quickly wrapping Isabella in a special thermal blanket before lifting her onto the stretcher. A respiratory support device was hastily fitted to her nose. Adrian stayed close beside, his hand trembling, but still holding tightly to his wife's icy hand. As they lifted Isabella onto the stretcher and began to push her towards the ambulance, Adrian turned his head to look for Malik. He saw the boy standing dazedly in the station doorway, his small body trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Come with us," Adrian shouted. Malik hesitated for a second, his eyes wavering. But when he saw Adrian's earnest gaze, he snapped out of it and immediately ran over. He rushed after the stretcher, his bare feet pounding on the freezing snow. The ambulance doors slammed shut behind them, silencing the howling wind outside. Inside, the air was still cold, but filled with the sound of machinery and hurried voices. A doctor sat right beside Isabella, his hand constantly checking her vital signs, his eyes glued to the heart monitor. "We have to keep her conscious. Otherwise, both mother and child are in danger," the doctor said quickly, while signaling the nurse to prepare an additional oxygen tank. Adrian sat beside her, holding his wife's hand tightly, his mouth constantly whispering, "Isabella, listen to me. Try hard. We can't stop now." Malik sat huddled in the corner of the ambulance, his arms wrapped around his knees. He looked at Isabella, then at Adrian, a feeling he couldn't describe rising within him: worry, fear, and hope. The ambulance shook constantly as it sped over the slippery roads. The doctor kept urging the driver to go faster, even though wind and snow still surrounded them. Malik looked out of the fogged-up window. The scenery flashed by like blurry ghosts. Sometimes the blue light of a street lamp flashed and then disappeared, giving way to thick darkness. In a brief moment, Malik closed his eyes, whispering in his heart, "Please don't let her die. Please." The heart monitor beeped steadily, but weakly. Isabella stirred, letting out a sound that was almost inaudible. "She's awake!" Adrian exclaimed, tightening his grip on his wife's hand. Isabella's eyes fluttered open, cloudy with exhaustion and pain. She gasped for breath, her lips moving soundlessly. "We're almost at the hospital. Just a little longer," Adrian whispered, leaning close to her ear. Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, a tear rolling down her cheek, freezing into a tiny piece of ice in the cold. Malik clenched his hands tighter, holding his breath as he watched. Ahead, the blue neon lights of the hospital began to gleam in the distance. "Faster!" the doctor shouted towards the driver's compartment. "We're holding on by the minute." The ambulance tilted sharply to one side as it made a sharp turn into the emergency entrance. When the vehicle stopped, the doors burst open. Another team of nurses and doctors was already waiting, whisking Isabella away on a gurney as soon as the wheels stopped rolling. Adrian rushed after the gurney. Malik followed, breathless, but not allowing himself to fall behind. The hospital corridor was filled with cold white light and the strong smell of disinfectant. The sound of footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor. A large door swung open. A nurse held Adrian back. "I'm sorry, sir, you'll have to wait here." Adrian stopped, his eyes filled with pain as he watched the door swing shut, obscuring Isabella and everything that mattered most to him. He stood there, motionless, with only Malik beside him, looking up at him with wide, worried eyes. Adrian slowly sank onto the cold waiting room bench. Malik quietly sat down beside him, not saying a word. Outside, the blizzard still hadn't stopped, but inside, between the fragile heartbeats and the flickering blue lights, something had begun to take root. Something like hope. The ambulance engine roared in the cold night, a muffled sound amidst the howling wind and the snow that hammered against the vehicle like icy lashes. The ambulance lurched violently on the frozen road, tires sliding sideways each time the driver tried to accelerate through a curve. Inside the cramped compartment, the air was thick with tension. Malik sat huddled in the back seat, his small hands clutching the frayed hem of his old coat as if holding on to something safe. His eyes, fixed on Isabella, who was writhing on the stretcher, were filled with worry and fear. Beside the stretcher, Adrian held his wife's hand tightly, not daring to let go for even a second. His cold fingers trembled uncontrollably, his face pale with anxiety and helplessness. "Just a little longer, my love," Adrian repeated, like a prayer, his lips moving almost unconsciously. The heart monitor beeped steadily, but weakly. The attending doctor in the ambulance, a middle-aged man, checked her pulse as he muttered into his radio. "We're on our way. Patient in labor, severe hypothermia. Prepare an emergency delivery team." Then he turned to look at Adrian, his eyes not hiding his tension. "Listen to me," the doctor said sternly. "If she doesn't deliver soon, both of them will be in danger. We can't wait until the hospital." Adrian froze. He looked at Isabella, saw her straining, her face contorted, her lips bleeding from being bitten tightly in pain. A violent contraction hit. Isabella cried out hoarsely, her body arching reflexively. The doctor signaled the nurse to prepare the instruments, then turned to Adrian. "Help her breathe properly. Push when I tell you." Adrian nodded quickly, his voice almost breaking. "Can you hear me, Isabella? Breathe with me. We'll get through this." Malik, sitting in the corner of the ambulance, watched with bated breath. His hands were clasped tightly together, squeezed so hard his knuckles were white. He had never witnessed anything like this, both terrifying and strangely sacred. The doctor leaned close to Isabella's ear, his voice urgent. "Listen to me, Isabella. When the pain comes, you have to push. Now take a deep breath and push." Isabella groaned, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She tried to nod, gathering the last of her strength. A second contraction hit. "Push, Isabella," the doctor commanded, his hand resting lightly on her belly to feel the progress. Isabella strained, pushing out with a choked groan. Adrian's hands tightened on her shoulders, giving her mental strength. Malik saw Isabella's forehead covered in a cold sweat, her lips trembling with exhaustion, but in her eyes there was still a strange, stubborn will. She wouldn't give up. The ambulance jolted violently over a large pothole. Everyone in the compartment swayed. But the doctor didn't take his hands off Isabella. "Push harder." "One more time." Isabella took a long breath, squeezed her eyes shut, and pushed again, her whole body tensing to its limit. A faint sound rang out. A cry. Weak. Malik's eyes widened. He couldn't believe his ears. The doctor quickly caught the tiny being, cutting the umbilical cord swiftly. A nurse immediately wrapped the baby boy in a thermal blanket, drying him and gently patting his back to stimulate breathing. The initially weak cry gradually turned into a louder, stronger wail. Adrian looked at the baby, tears welling up uncontrollably. He reached out a trembling hand and gently touched his son's cheek, his lips moving in silent words. Malik sat frozen, his throat tight, his wide eyes filling with hot tears. He had never witnessed anything so miraculous. In the midst of a harsh blizzard, on the fragile boundary between life and death, a new cry was born. The baby boy, red, fragile but full of life, lay snugly in the blanket, his tiny hands waving weakly. The doctor let out a long breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "We saved the baby. Now let's focus on saving the mother." The nurse quickly checked Isabella's condition again. Her pulse was weak, her blood pressure dangerously low. The doctor barked orders. "Inject adrenaline. Prepare an IV as soon as we reach the hospital." Malik sat motionless, his heart filled with both happiness and a gripping fear. Adrian gently cradled the baby boy in his arms, holding him close to his chest to keep him warm. He whispered, his voice hoarse, "Hello, son. Eli." Malik heard the name, a short but resonant name that filled the ambulance compartment. Eli. A new beginning, a life snatched from the ice and despair. The ambulance swerved sharply into the hospital gates, tires screeching, but the driver held the wheel steady, navigating the icy road like a warrior familiar with danger. When the vehicle came to a complete stop, the back doors swung open. A team of doctors and nurses was already waiting, quickly taking Isabella and baby Eli out. Adrian followed, holding the child tightly in his arms, his eyes not leaving his wife for a second. Malik followed slowly, feeling smaller than ever amidst the sea of white coats hurrying around. He whispered, unheard by anyone, just loud enough for himself to know, "Hang in there, Mrs. Isabella. Hang in there." And then, Isabella's figure disappeared behind the emergency room doors. Malik stopped, his small hand hanging limply at his side. The cold white light of the hospital crept into every corner of the waiting room, where Malik huddled on a hard plastic chair, his legs drawn up to his chest. In his hands, the mug of hot cocoa had long since cooled, but Malik still clutched it, like the only warm thing left in this swirling world. Down the hallway, the emergency room doors remained closed. Adrian stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes fixed on the door, as if the slightest distraction would shatter all hope. Occasionally, a nurse pushed a trolley swiftly past, or a doctor in a white coat hurried by. But no one stopped. Time here felt stretched and suffocating. The soft tap of shoes on the floor pulled Malik from his jumbled thoughts. A man in a dark suit, walking quickly, his face as cold as the night frost, approached Adrian. In his hand, he held a thick file, neatly clipped. "Mr. Whitmore," the man stopped, his voice lowered just enough not to draw attention. "We have information." Adrian turned, his tired eyes flicking quickly over the man before settling on the file. "Speak," Adrian said curtly. The man opened the file, pulling out a stack of security camera printouts. "We've reviewed all the data from your residence and the accident site. Analysis shows that Mrs. Isabella's SUV had its electrical system tampered with before leaving the garage." Adrian froze. Not a natural accident. not bad luck. Someone had done it on purpose. The blood in his veins seemed to turn to ice. The image of Isabella lying still, her breath faint, and baby Eli, so new to the world, crying his first cries, overlapped in his mind, forming a simmering wave of fury. "Who, exactly?" Adrian growled, each word like a nail hammered into the icy floor. The man glanced around, then said quietly, "We have evidence indicating that one of the technicians with garage access privileges interfered with the vehicle. Internal surveillance logs show Vincent Blake, your assistant, was present shortly before Mrs. Isabella departed." Adrian's chest heaved with anger. He turned away, clenching his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. Vincent Blake, the man he had trusted for so many years. Adrian's voice, when he spoke again, was like ice. "I want all the data, all the footage. Summon him, immediately." "Yes, sir." The staff member nodded, quietly stepping back, leaving Adrian standing there, alone, in a silent rage. In the corner of the room, Malik, though too young to fully understand what had just transpired, clearly sensed the change in the atmosphere. He saw that Adrian was different now, no longer the exhausted and desperate man, but a wounded lion roaring inwardly, ready to pounce on its enemy. Malik quietly tightened his grip on the cold mug of cocoa, a feeling of unease creeping into his heart. A moment later, a young nurse approached Adrian, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Whitmore," she called softly. Adrian turned instantly, his eyes desperate, as if clinging to any sliver of news. "How is she?" "We've stabilized Mrs. Isabella's heart rate," the nurse said quickly, "but she's very weak. We need more time to run tests. Baby Eli is being kept warm in the neonatal unit. He's very resilient." A faint smile flickered across Adrian's lips, but his eyes remained shadowed with worry. "Can I go see them?" Malik asked suddenly, his voice small but firm. The nurse bent down, looking at Malik with gentle eyes. "Not yet, little guy. Mrs. Isabella needs time to recover. But I promise, when she's more stable, you'll be the first to see her." Malik nodded, quickly turning his face away to hide his stinging eyes. Adrian approached, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. A simple, silent gesture. But Malik understood. In this moment, they were allies, standing together on the same side. A heavy silence filled the cold white hallway. Malik leaned his head against the wall, his eyelids drooping, while Adrian slumped onto the chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. The intercom crackled with short medical commands. A young doctor in blue scrubs hurried over, a chart in his hand. "Mr. Whitmore," he called, "we need your consent to take Mrs. Isabella into surgery if necessary. Her heart rate is erratic." Adrian stood up immediately. "Whatever needs to be done, do it now," he said, his voice firm, brooking no hesitation. "We'll do our best." The doctor nodded, then hurried away. Adrian clenched his fists, his eyes glued to the operating room doors, as if he could see through them. Malik edged closer to him, whispering, "She'll be okay, won't she?" Adrian looked down at Malik. A moment of hesitation, then he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing gently. "She's very strong," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We have to believe in her." Outside, the snow continued to fall, a white expanse as if unaware of the silent battles being fought within the walls of this hospital. But here, in the cold white light and the fragile beeps of the vital signs monitor, a truth was slowly emerging. It wasn't just the blizzard outside that had threatened their lives. There was another storm, colder, more ruthless, lurking within the very people they had once trusted. And this time, Adrian Whitmore vowed he wouldn't lose anyone else. Afternoon faded slowly, trailing weak rays of light seeping through the frosted window panes. The cold winter light stretched across the grey tile floor, making the recovery room eerily quiet. Malik sat idly by the window, the empty paper cup twirling between his small palms. His young eyes followed the snowflakes falling silently outside, his heart heavy with nameless thoughts. Suddenly, the door clicked open, making Malik jump. He turned his head, and his heart seemed to stop. Isabella. Her eyes were open, tired and weak. They scanned the room, settling on the small bassinet beside the bed, where baby Eli was sleeping soundly, his breathing soft and steady. A faint smile bloomed on Isabella's dry lips. Her strength seemed depleted, but the gentle light in her eyes was still enough to warm the chilly room. She tried to move, turning her head slightly towards Malik. When their eyes met, Isabella whispered softly, her voice trembling, "Thank you, child, for saving my baby and me." Malik stood frozen, his throat tight. He didn't know how to respond. He only knew how to clench the empty cup in his hand, nodding vigorously, his eyes welling up with tears. Adrian stood right beside the bed, holding his wife's weak hand. His eyes shone with relief, joy, and a mingled gratitude. He bent down, kissing Isabella lightly on the forehead, then raised his head to look at Malik. Adrian's gaze at that moment softened, a strange light shining in his eyes, the light of someone who had found their most precious thing after long days of despair. He spoke, his voice hoarse but warm. "Malik, if you'd like, we have a place for you." Malik stared blankly. The words poured into his ears like warm water after the biting blizzard. No one had ever asked him that. No one, after everything, had ever opened their arms to a street child like him. He was flustered, lowering his head, his small hands clenching together. Isabella tried to reach out a weak hand towards him, the gentle smile still lingering on her lips. "You don't have to be cold and alone anymore." Malik felt his throat tighten. He nodded, hot tears streaming down his thin cheeks. A home, a family. He had never dared to dream of it, but now it was reaching out to him in the midst of the coldest winter days. That warmth, though fragile, had somewhat soothed the storm within Adrian. However, another storm still raged, the storm of betrayal. About an hour later, when Isabella was more stable and baby Eli was being well cared for by the nurses, Adrian received word from his private investigation team. All the evidence had been gathered. Without hesitation, he decided to confront Vincent Blake personally. Adrian walked into a temporary office in the hospital where Vincent was waiting with a worried and uneasy expression. The man was dressed in an expensive suit, but his fidgety demeanor couldn't hide the fear gnawing at him. Adrian slammed the door shut behind him, his eyes as cold as steel. "Vincent," he growled, "we need to talk." Vincent stood up abruptly, his hands clasped tightly together. "Adrian, I'm so sorry about what happened to Isabella. Shut up." Adrian cut him off, throwing the thick file onto the table, the printouts of security camera footage, car records, and access logs clearly visible. "Explain," Adrian said, his voice even, but each word like a hammer blow. Vincent swallowed hard, stammering, I didn't think things would get this bad. I just wanted to scare Isabella a little, to make her give up the idea of transferring control of the company. I didn't expect her to go out on the night of the storm." Adrian's eyes darkened. He clenched his fists so tightly, his knuckles cracked. "You wanted to profit from my family's misfortune." His voice lowered, thick with rage. Vincent hung his head, not daring to look up. I thought if Isabella gave up, you'd need someone you could trust to run the company. I just wanted a promotion. I swear, I didn't intend to kill anyone." Adrian stepped closer, his voice like a razor. "You put my wife, my son, and an innocent child in mortal danger for your own petty ambition." Vincent stammered, "I'll resign. I'll leave immediately. Please don't call the police." Adrian stood up straight, his gaze like knives cutting through Vincent. "You think I'll let you get off that easily?" The assistant trembled uncontrollably as Adrian turned to make a call, his voice decisive. "Bring him to the police. Charge him with attempted murder. I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Vincent slumped into the chair, knowing the game was over. When Adrian returned to the recovery room, it was completely dark outside. The lights in the room were dim, enveloping the sleeping Isabella and baby Eli, who was stirring in his bassinet. Malik, sitting in the corner of the room, looked up at Adrian, his eyes full of questions. Adrian walked over, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right now. The bad man has been dealt with." Malik nodded, a feeling he couldn't quite name welling up inside him. He didn't fully understand the adult world, but he clearly sensed the danger had passed. A small family, though still fragile, had been protected, thanks to the courage of small but indomitable hearts. In this small room, the light of hope had been kindled, steadier and warmer than ever before. A week passed. Snow still lay thick on the ground, but it wasn't as pristine white as before. The first drops of water dripped from the icy eaves, tapping slowly like a herald of winter's imminent retreat. Malik sat on the hospital steps, his small feet resting on the lower step, his arms wrapped around the old woolen scarf that had been carefully mended with slightly clumsy stitches. Isabella had patiently sat for hours knitting it for him, her hands still weak, but determined to hold the needles. Malik squeezed the scarf to his chest, feeling each rough but strangely warm stitch. The boy didn't need anyone to say it. Just seeing Isabella's eyes, seeing Adrian cradle baby Eli and soothe him, Malik knew. He was no longer alone. Adrian held Eli in his arms, swaying gently, whispering little stories that only father and son seemed to understand. The baby wriggled a bit, then settled contentedly to sleep, his face rosy from the cold. From a distance, the sound of a car engine grew closer, mingling with the faint sounds of the city slowly waking up. An old pickup truck approached, not flashy, not sleek, but clean and sturdy like this new family. Adrian gently placed Eli into the car seat, which had been padded with an extra warm blanket. He turned to Malik, giving him a kind smile. "Come on, let's go home." Malik looked up, a strange, tender light shimmering in his young eyes, a fragile mixture of eagerness and deep-seated apprehension, like someone who had spent too many endless nights in the cold, forgotten corners of the world, and now, for the very first time, was daring to squint into the sunlight. His small fingers clutched tightly at the woolen scarf wrapped carefully around his neck, the rough, patched fabric scratching at his skin, anchoring him to reality. It was real. This wasn't a dream stitched together from longings and lonely nights. He wasn't about to wake up to the howling wind against a concrete wall or the hollow ache of an empty stomach. This was happening. Drawing in a shaky breath that shivered in his chest, Malik slowly rose to his feet. His heart thudded wildly, louder even than the wet crunch of melting snow under his battered shoes. The chilly air pricked at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. All of his focus was fixed on the battered pickup truck waiting in front of him, humming quietly, the engine a steady, reassuring beat against the hush of the winter afternoon. It looked almost too ordinary. Paint faded, tires caked with slush. And yet to Malik, it might as well have been a chariot sent by some unseen force, ready to carry him into a life he had never dared to imagine. Step by careful step, Malik crossed the thin strip of sidewalk, the wet patches soaking into his soles. Each movement felt monumental, like crossing an invisible threshold that separated the life he had known, a life of cracked concrete, second-hand coats, and whispered fears from something else entirely. Inside the truck, Isabella sat bundled in a thick coat. Her figure turned slightly toward the door, as if waiting just for him. Her delicate frame still bore the marks of her harrowing fight. The pallor of her skin, the gaunt hollows beneath her cheekbones, but none of that diminished the brightness of her smile. It was a smile that lit up the dim interior of the truck more warmly than any fireplace Malik had ever crouched beside for stolen bits of heat. It was a smile that spoke of patience, of welcome, of unconditional space being made for him. Her arms opened toward him in a silent embrace, and when she spoke, her voice carried through the thin, crisp air. A tether tossed across the unknown, pulling him closer. "Come here, Malik," she said, her voice steady and sure, imbued with something far deeper than mere kindness. Something sturdy and fierce, like the roots of an old oak tree clinging to the earth through storm and drought alike. For a moment, Malik froze. It was just a heartbeat, but it felt endless. His instincts screamed caution, the instincts honed over years of survival, of distrust, of knowing that good things, when they appeared, usually vanished just as quickly. But then, slowly, another feeling began to rise, stronger, braver, hope. Like a dam breaking under the weight of spring's first thaw, Malik bolted forward. The patched scarf flapped wildly against his chest as he ran, legs pumping, breath tearing from his lungs in short, urgent bursts. He reached the truck door, scrambled up the side, and clambered into the seat without hesitation. Isabella shifted to make room, smiling even wider, and Malik slid into the space she had deliberately kept open for him. The space meant not for a guest or a temporary visitor, but for family. Adrian closed the door behind him with a soft but certain thud, sealing them inside the small, warm world of the truck. The noise of the outside world, the soft dripping of snow, the distant hum of tires on wet asphalt, was muffled into silence. Inside, there was only warmth. Malik sat rigid for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple, unbelievable fact of being inside. Not sheltering temporarily, not hiding or stealing a moment of safety, but belonging. He inhaled deeply, the scent of the truck filling his senses. It smelled faintly of clean laundry, of bread still warm from the oven, of baby Eli's soft, powdery sweetness drifting from his carrier, tucked safely behind the seats. It smelled like soap, wool, a hint of coffee from a thermos perched between the front seats. And something else, something richer and deeper, something Malik couldn't immediately name. It smelled like trust. It smelled like mornings that began with the smell of breakfast and the sound of voices, not the sharp ache of hunger. It smelled like hands ready to steady him when he stumbled, like light filtering through kitchen windows, like rooms that waited for him to come home. It smelled like belonging. Malik pressed his back against the worn leather seat, feeling the way it gave a little beneath his weight, like it had already accepted him. No words were needed. The silence between them was complete, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with a quiet, shared understanding. A beginning. The engine rumbled softly to life. The tires crunched across the wet, thawing snow, leaving behind the sterile halls of the hospital where too many battles had been fought, too many tears had been shed. Through the frosted window, Malik watched the world slowly waking up from its long slumber. Cafes were flickering their lights on, thin ribbons of smoke spiraling out of chimneys like fragile prayers to the softening sky. Snowplows cleared the roads methodically, carving paths through the last stubborn vestiges of winter. Ahead of them, the road stretched straight and true, leading to a small house Adrian had been preparing, quietly, carefully, ever since those long, anxious days when Isabella lay in the hospital bed. It was a real home, not a place to pass through, not a corner to hide in. A home with a deep red roof that gleamed even under the tired winter sun. A small patch of garden where wild daisies would soon bloom again. And, most incredibly of all, a room just for Malik. His own space, his own bed, his own window to the world. Malik leaned against Isabella's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing, the undeniable proof that she was alive, that they were all alive. His eyelids fluttered closed, not from fear or exhaustion, but from peace. Pure, unfamiliar peace. For the first time, he didn't need to guard his dreams. He didn't have to stay half awake, listening for danger lurking in the night. He didn't have to brace for the cold wind seeping through cracked walls and broken promises. For the first time, Malik understood what it meant to belong to someone, and to be belonged to. Behind them, the long, brutal winter, the kind that froze not only skin, but also hearts, was finally surrendering. Ahead of them, even though the sun was pale and hesitant, it painted the world with the faintest strokes of gold, promising a future that Malik had never dared to picture. He lifted his face toward the timid sunlight, letting it kiss his cheeks, seep into the small cracks inside his battered spirit. And then, without realizing he had spoken aloud, Malik whispered, a word so simple, yet so sacred, it filled every corner of his chest. Home.